Eustass Captain Kidd carries the blood of the Davy clan. When people hear Davy Jones, they think of Pirates of the Caribbean. But long before that, back in the 18th century, Tobias Smollett introduced the phrase Davy Jones's locker in Chapter 15 of The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle. In that novel, writing about sailors' superstitions, he depicts Davy Jones as a kind of demon or sea spirit that drags sailors down into the locker, the depths of the sea. You've probably seen one of the illustrations of Davy Jones from that work. It looks a lot like the tattoo on the barkeep at the pub where Luffy and Blackbeard first met. And Smollett himself was Scottish, which brings another link to mind. Eustass Captain Kidd. His name is most likely based on William Kidd, who was also from Scotland, and Eustass Kidd's image country has been set as Scotland too. By the way, I once put forward the theory that Blackbeard might be descended from Davy Jones, and the spark for that idea came from the 4760 in his bounty. In Japanese wordplay, that number can be read as Yona no Rei, which means the ghost of Yona. The name Davy Jones first appeared in print back in 1726, and by the 19th century, some dictionaries were actually defining it as the ghost of Yona. And here's the kicker. Kidd's bounty 2 years later also contains the elements of Yona and ghost in it. On top of that, Kidd's hobby is listening to music, and many of his techniques have punk in the name. He clearly likes punk rock. You can't ignore the music connection either, since Zebek of the Davy clan even called himself Rocks. I've argued that Davy Jones's locker and a musician rocker are thematically connected, and in that sense too, Kidd is being hinted at as related to the Davy clan. And because there are also connections between Kidd and the God Valley incident, in this video I'm going to dig deep into his background and the secrets he's been hiding. To be honest, Kidd was never one of my favorite characters. But while researching for this video, I realized all over again just how fascinating he really is. By the time you finish watching this, I think a lot of you might start to see his appeal too. And actually, I used to live on the outskirts of Edinburgh for a while. I'd love to go back to Edinburgh someday if I get the chance. I know probably not many of you live there, but if anyone does, let me know. By the way, I'm guessing a lot of you probably found this channel recently through this video. Back in March 2024, I put out this video where I suggested that Blackbeard might actually carry the blood of Davy Jones, and that theory has now become reality. In the past, I also predicted that the world of One Piece would sink, and in both cases, the biggest hints came from the nuances of Japanese expressions. These are things you just can't really pick up with a translation tool. The wordplay, the feel of the language, the cultural background. Since I'm a native Japanese speaker, I share the kinds of insights and analysis that can only be drawn directly from the original Japanese version of One Piece. And on my Patreon, I do this kind of detailed translation and breakdown every week for the latest chapters. There, you'll find discussions on questions from members as well as in-depth content that includes native-level translations of each new chapter. I keep the number of members limited each month, so if you'd like to connect more deeply, definitely check out my page. Oh, and YouTube recently added this new hype feature too, right? With likes and comments, and now even more ways to react, it almost feels like there's too much to keep up with. I know a lot of you are probably listening while working or driving, so just react in whatever way feels comfortable. No pressure at all. Just like I wrote in the thumbnail, I believe Eustass Captain Kidd might actually be carrying the blood of the Davy family. First, we know Kidd comes from the South Blue, but the biggest clue that he could be connected to the Davy D bloodline shows up in the God Valley incident. 38 years ago, the natives of God Valley were targeted in a massacre tournament organized by the Celestial Dragons. Among them, the Davy family in particular were treated as ultra-rare prey, like some kind of super-rare rabbits. At that time, Bartholomew Kuma became famous for saving 500 people, both God Valley residents and slaves who had been brought there from Maria Joie. The way he managed to do this was by eating the Nikyu Nikyu fruit. Later, in an SBS, Oda Sensei revealed that this fruit's power only allows the user to send people or objects to places they've personally visited before. So the question is, what places had Kuma already been to before God Valley? In his childhood, he lived in the Sorbet Kingdom in South Blue, then was captured by the world government and taken all the way to Maria Joie. It's reasonable to assume that on the journey there, they would have stopped at several islands along the way. That means when Kuma sent those 500 people away, most of them likely ended up back in the South Blue. And if that's the case, then it's not far-fetched to think that some descendants of the Davy family were among them. This is where Kid comes in. I think one of Kid's parents was a descendant of the Davy family, who, after being sent to South Blue, eventually settled there, married into the Eustass family, and gave birth to Kid. That would explain why Kid still carries some of the Davy D blood. Diluted, yes, but still present. And the fact that Kid deliberately chose Shanks as his target among the 4 emperors probably wasn't just a coincidence. It feels like the Davy blood running through him pulled him toward that fate. After all, Shanks already has a bitter history with another Davy. He once fought one and ended up with the scar near his left eye. So in a way, this clash with Kid could be seen as a prelude to the greater battle that might one day come against the true Davy D family. In the end, Kid's crew ironically fell victim to Davy Jones's locker at the bottom of the sea. And even the fact that Kid drew Elbaf in the Wano arc's lot drawing feels like destiny. Rayleigh once said, "Maybe there are no coincidences in this world. Connections form as if everything is inevitable." When he met Blackbeard, Rayleigh also told him, "It's childish, but I really don't like you." And his partner Shakuyaku, when talking to Luffy about the rookies gathering at Sabaody, said this, "The reason Captain Kid's bounty is higher than yours is because he and his crew have caused a lot of damage to civilians. Not very cute, right? That's why I'm absolutely rooting for you, Monkey-chan." The fact that both Rayleigh and Shakuyaku spoke so harshly about 2 different members of the Davy bloodline, it doesn't feel like just a coincidence either. And one of the most striking figures we see at God Valley is, of course, the mother of Shanks and Shamrock. What really stands out about her is, well, her sexy figure, especially her hips. But on top of that, she's got red hair. Now, we don't know for sure whether Shanks's mother carries Davy blood, but in the world of One Piece, characters with red hair are extremely rare. That makes me wonder, could Kid's red hair be the result of inheriting blood from both the Davy family and this red-haired woman's lineage who happened to be living in God Valley? Something else worth noting is that in the black and white manga, only Shanks, Shamrock, and their mother are drawn using tone shading. Kid, on the other hand, isn't shaded that way. To me, that suggests Kid might only be partially carrying this red-haired woman's bloodline, which would explain the subtle difference in how he's depicted. By the way, among the other groups that seem connected to the clan of D, there's someone else with red hair. Kalgara. He and his people lived on Jaya, carrying on their own unique culture. Naturally, they weren't part of the world government, and they had the important role of protecting the poneglyphs. The look, the vibe, and that aggressive, almost xenophobic edge, That's definitely something Kid has in common too. And if you look at the 4 most important stones, the ones that reveal the location of Laugh-Tale, it's no coincidence that those poneglyphs were made with red coloring. That suggests red carried deep meaning for the forces connected to the ancient kingdom. Even the fact that the massive continent stretching across the seas of the One Piece world is called the Red Line, or the continent of Red Earth, feels like it has to tie into this as well. It could be that within the D faction, families with red hair held important roles across generations. Maybe that's why they played a part not only on God Valley, where the Davy family lived, but also on Jaya, where a unique culture had been preserved. To go even further, characters with red hair, like Kanjuro from Wano or Sicilian from the Mokomo dukedom, often seem to be part of groups that stood against the world government. It makes me wonder if these red-haired people might have once served the clan of D, the same way the Red Scabbards served under Odin. If that's the case, then the red-haired clan of God Valley might have had the role of protecting the Davy family from the outside world. Or, just like Kalgra, they could have been tasked with guarding the poneglyphs. It's likely that the reason Garling discovered the Davy clan's presence on God Valley was because of his close relationship with that red-haired woman. And if the red-haired bloodline had historically been deeply connected to the Davy family, then it's possible that once she grew close to Garling, she revealed that connection to him. That could very well have been what set all these events in motion. Oda Sensei actually dropped a hint recently that connects Kid with God Valley and the West Blue. What I want to focus on here is the name of Kid's ship, the Victoria Punk. That name most likely comes from Kid and Killer's first love, Victoria Shirutin Dolya Naika. But there's actually another character who carries the name Victoria, and that's Victoria Sindri, who used to be a stage actress in the West Blue. Technically, the spelling in Japanese is a little different. One is written as Victoria, and the other as Victoria. If you forced it, you could render Sindri's version as Victoria. But really, Japanese doesn't clearly distinguish between B and V. Recently, though, translators have started to separate the two more often. Personally, I think the difference in spelling just comes from the fact that they were once the same family, but became separated long ago. It's kind of like how Moria is known as Gecko to the wider world, but in Wano he's connected to the Kozuki family. By the way, I've talked about the Kozuki family and Moria before on the Dawn Dusk Owners channel, so check that out if you want the details. But to put it simply, I believe the Kozuki family and Gecko Moria are actually branches of the same clan, split apart long ago between Wano and the West Blue. In the same way, I think these two women were originally from the same family that got split apart long ago. Both of them are already gone, of course, but Sindri once lived in the West Blue, while Dolya Naika lived in the South Blue. So what caused this family to be scattered in the first place? Most likely, it all goes back to the God Valley incident. It seems the Victoria family originally lived on God Valley and were caught up in the so-called native cleansing tournament. Dolya Naika's parents were probably among those rescued by Kuma, just like Kid's parents, and sent off to the South Blue. On the other hand, Sindri's parents may have managed to escape God Valley on their own and found refuge on another island in the West Blue. And just like how the Kozuki name in Wano is written differently from Gecko in the outside world, I think the spelling differences between Victoria and Victoria in Japanese reflect how the same family's name ended up being written differently across the West Blue and the South Blue. By the way, Kid and Dolya Naika were both born on Kozuk Island, which isn't affiliated with the world government. Maybe that made it the perfect place for people who had been sent flying from God Valley to settle down. This island's name itself seems to come from the Japanese verb kutsuku, which means to stick or to attach. That ties in perfectly with kids' power since magnets are all about making things stick together. Personally, I think Kid's Jiki Jiki no Mi might have been one of the things that got sent flying from God Valley along with his parents. In other words, the very devil fruit Kid inherited could have originally been one of the prizes offered in that so-called native cleansing tournament at God Valley. Another thing I want to point out about Kid, do you remember what his hobby is? It's listening to music. You can see it reflected in his attacks. Damned Punk, Punk Gibson, and even Punk Pistols. That last one is almost certainly a reference to the Sex Pistols, the punk rock band that rose up in London. On top of that, his ship's name, the Victoria Punk, makes it pretty clear he's got a love for punk rock. And about Punk Gibson, the name Gibson comes from one of the most famous music manufacturers in the world, a brand any music lover would recognize. Interestingly enough, the name Gibson Jr. also shows up in a certain baseball manga. And here's a fun coincidence. The voice actor for Gibson Jr. is the same person who voices Eustass Captain Kidd.
Joe Gibson Jr.! 世界に示さないままゲームセットはね出てこい赤髪
When we hear the word punk in music, most of us think of punk rock. And I believe the reason Davy D. Zebek called himself Rox D. Zebek is also tied to music. To me, it feels like the Davy family has always carried down the importance of music through their bloodline. That would also explain why Rox was so drawn to that woman. After all, Blackbeard today doesn't go by Rox D. Teach, but by Marshall D. Teach. That suggests he inherited the surname Marshall from his mother. And if you know rock music, you'll know that one of the most famous guitar amp brands is Marshall. Just like a rock band can't perform without an amp, maybe Oda Sensei is hinting that Rox himself needed a Marshall in his life. And One Piece has shown us over and over again how deeply music and the soul are connected. Vegapunk himself even stated that the soul really exists, and it's no coincidence that here too, the word punk shows up in the name. And the character who really embodies the bond between music and the soul is none other than the Soul King himself, Brook. He outright says, "Music shakes the soul." We saw this clearly on Whole Cake Island, where his music actually nullified souls. In the world of One Piece, it really feels like music itself holds the power to influence, or even control, the soul. And isn't it strange how, when Kid unleashes his damned punk attack, a skeletal shape appears on his shoulder? That's another eerie little connection back to this theme of music and the soul. And when we talk about music, we can't leave out Nika. There's a legend about him. Through his unique rhythm and dance, he could make people laugh. In fact, there's even that scene where Emeth woke up after hearing Nika's rhythm. To me, that's a perfect symbol of how music can stir the soul. And this instantly brings to mind the lyrics of Binks no Sake. The waves will dance, strike up the drums. Literally, Nika's drums were making the waves dance, and if you look closely, even the ship was drawn as if it were dancing too. That suggests Nika's heartbeat doesn't just free people and animals, it can even make nature and objects move as if they had souls of their own. Which makes me think, maybe the true rockers of the One Piece world are those who can command the soul through music. And believe it or not, Rox himself recently made a remark that sounded like he knew about the existence of souls. He says this line, As long as I can get my wife and kid out of here, that's enough. I don't feel like luck's on my side, Harold. Doesn't that sound like he already sensed his own death was coming? Think about it. This is a man with an enormous ambition to take over the world, and yet here he's saying, as long as my wife and kid escape, that's enough. Oda Sensei even puts emphasis on that phrase, that's enough. To me, that shows Rox believed that even if he died physically, his soul would live on through his child, Teach, who would carry on his will. That's why he could say something like that with conviction. And that ties right into Blackbeard's Jolly Roger, the 3 skulls. They represent 3 generations of will. Teach himself, Rox, whose soul he inherited, and Davy Jones, the figure Rox revered. By the way, in Japan, the soul is sometimes depicted as a kind of floating fireball, and that same kind of design shows up on Rox's Jolly Roger, since he inherited the soul of Davy Jones. A pirate flag is meant to be a symbol of one's will, so it makes sense that a soul would be worked into the design. And interestingly enough, the Kid Pirates flag also has a design that looks a lot like a soul too. So I think within the Davy Jones lineage, there were always individuals born who carried a locker within their bodies, something that could preserve souls across generations. I've explained this in more detail in another video, so check that out if you're interested. Let's also take a look at something Kid said 2 years ago at the human auction house. He said, "The world is run by scum, so you've got to become scum yourself." Up to that point, there hadn't been any panels showing Kid actually witnessing the actions of the celestial dragons at Sabayodi, but the moment he realized their existence, that was his reaction. Then, after seeing the auction scene unfold, he added, "It's like a miniature version of the whole world." Those words suggest he already knew what the celestial dragons were really doing behind the scenes. Most likely, Kid's parents had told him about the horrific events they went through at God Valley. And Kid, growing up with those stories burned into him, spoke from that perspective when he said those lines. Now, let's look at what I personally think is Kid's most memorable line. Compared to the so-called purity of greedy rulers, the world's villains are actually more humane. And that hits hard, because the God Valley incident itself was born from the so-called purity of greedy rulers. In reality, the people labeled as villains, Roger and Rox, ended up being the ones who gave the citizens and slaves hope. It was only because the Roger and Rox pirates crashed the event that Ivankov and Kuma even had a chance to get close to the prizes, and from that, Kuma was able to gain the Nikyu fruit and use it to save people. Even Whitebeard himself didn't seem to fully believe that the celestial dragons were capable of such horrors. And outside of Garp's Hero of God Valley story, the truth of what happened was completely erased from history. So when Kid says that line, it really sounds less like a casual remark and more like the words of someone who already knew exactly what atrocities the celestial dragons had committed at God Valley. And then there's Kid's reaction when he saw Luffy punch St. Charlos. He said, "So I finally got to see just how crazy Straw Hat Luffy really is, just like the rumor said. No complaints here." Now, Kid is usually openly hostile to anyone outside of his own crew, so the fact that instead of being angry about getting dragged into the mess, he made a comment like that, it's rare for him. On top of that, he even volunteered to take care of the Marines surrounding them himself. Sure, part of it was probably to show off his strength to the other worst generation captains, but I think there was also a sense of payback. An acknowledgement of Luffy's act of striking a celestial dragon. So, After those three on Sabaody went on to defeat the Emperors Kaido and Big Mom in Wano, each of them set off on their own course, and that's where we saw the worst generation clash head-on with the four emperors. The first matchup, Law versus Blackbeard, and the other, Shanks versus Kid. At first glance, both of these pairings made perfect sense. Law and Blackbeard had already crossed paths in the Rocky Port incident, where they actually fought side by side for a time. On the other hand, Shanks and Kid had clashed before too, and we know it went so far that Kid lost his left arm to Beckman. But what really grabs my attention is this particular matchup. If Kid truly carries the blood of the Davy family, then that gives him a point of connection with Blackbeard. But on the flip side, Shanks and Law actually share something in common too. They both have the same hobby: wandering. Now, in some translated contents of the Vivre card, this word gets rendered with a negative spin, like loiterer or drifter. But in Japanese, the word horo is often used in a more intentional way, describing someone who sets out on a journey or an adventure. Shanks and Doflamingo both love lobster, and despite being pirates, they share the common trait of having celestial dragon blood in their veins. But just like that, Shanks and Law, who also share the same hobby, have some deeper connections too. Shanks survived God Valley, while Law survived Minion Island, both by hiding inside treasure chests. And in both cases, they were saved thanks to the kindness of Marines. Another detail you can't ignore: both of those islands were given the subtitle Island of Destiny. It's likely that once Shanks learned about his own bloodline and the truth of the God Valley incident, that's what drove him to want to see more of the world. And Law himself has said he wants to learn more about the strange fate of the D. Maybe there's a pattern, that those who survive by being hidden in treasure chests end up with a longing to freely travel the world. In other words, while that matchup is about pirates clashing head-on, this one is also a pairing built on shared backgrounds. By the way, I've also prepared some articles that include Japanese translations of the Vivre cards and explanations of the different terms. If you're interested, check them out on Patreon. I'll be updating Vivre card articles regularly from here on too. So what role will Kid and Law play in the story from here on out? They teamed up to take down Big Mom and earned bounties of 3 billion each, standing shoulder to shoulder with Emperor Luffy. Kid and Law's image countries are Scotland and Germany, while Big Mom has Napoleon on her head. It's basically a setup that mirrors the Battle of Waterloo. But right after that, both of them were sunk by different emperors' crews. The big difference lies in the narration used to describe their defeats. When Kid was defeated by Shanks, the text read, "The Kid pirates, annihilated." The word kaimetsu means to be utterly destroyed and wiped out. And when the subject is a group or organization, it implies that it no longer functions as a group. On top of that, Oda Sensei mentioned in an SBS that readers don't need to remember the names of all 31 members of the Kid Pirates. That suggests that even if Kid and Killer survived individually, the crew itself may very well have come to an end as an organization at that point. In contrast, the way Law's defeat to Blackbeard was described was very different. The narration read, "The Heart Pirates defeated." The word haiboku simply means loss or defeat. It doesn't imply destruction, which means the crew still exists. So the fact that Oda Sensei chose different wording here suggests that the Heart Pirates still have a role to play in the story. And what really matters is that Law and Beppo managed to escape from the Blackbeard pirates. Remember, Luffy only truly started calling himself a pirate after recruiting Zoro. In the same way, even if it's just Law and Beppo left, the Heart Pirates can still function as a crew. That's why the narration used Haiboku instead of Kaimetsu. This points to the idea that the Heart Pirates still have unfinished business. The most likely outcome? Teaming up with Luffy and the Straw Hats again. In fact, Law seems more interested in uncovering the meaning of the D than in becoming Pirate King. Even when facing Big Mom, he said, "If I can't take down a monster like this, then I can't even study history." That shows what really drives him isn't taking down emperors for fame, but finding out the truth about the erased history of the D. And to achieve that, the fastest route might be joining forces with Luffy to take down the world government. So then, what about Kid? Unlike Law, Kid's goal has always been to become Pirate King. Because of that, it's hard to imagine him fully cooperating with Luffy. Even after the big battle on Onigashima in Wano, he still tried to challenge Luffy. You really get the sense that Oda-sensei wants to keep Kid firmly in the role of Luffy's rival. By the way, in this video, I predicted that Blackbeard will end up being Luffy's greatest rival and the final boss. There are a lot of reasons for that, but one big one is how their very first appearances emphasized their completely opposite tastes. Then Luffy and Blackbeard even got into a fight over the number of dishes they ordered. And interestingly, Kid is the another character Luffy has had that same kind of clash with. Remember in Wano when they were competing over how many Kibi Dango they could collect? That mirrored the way Luffy once fought over food orders. So even if Kid survived, his role would never shift into being Luffy's full ally. His position as Luffy's rival pirate will always remain, and honestly, that's the core consistency of his character.